You were born in 1939 in Witbank, about 100 miles east of Johannesburg. You said, if I have a trumpet, I won't bother anybody. You say music is your religion.
No, well, I was obsessed with, I was actually bewitched by music from infancy. And when I was 5 years old, my parents, to get me away from the gramophone, had me play the piano. They got me piano lessons. And like 9 years later, I saw a movie about a trumpet player, Big Spiderwick. It was called Young Man with a Horn, and I had to play the trumpet. And
in fact, it was a man of religion, Father Trevor Huddleston, who gave you your first trumpet.
He was the chaplain of my boarding school, St. Peter's, in Johannesburg. And he was interested in everybody. He knew my parents, he knew everybody's parents, and he was especially interested in restless people, which I was. And I was in bed with a cold, a bed flu, and he said, what would make you happy? Because I was always in trouble with the authorities anyway. And when you're expelled in those days, there was no other chance for you. And I said, Father, if I can get a trumpet, I won't bother anybody anymore. I said, are you sure, creature? I said, I'm positive. And with his last 15 pounds.
With his last 15 pounds?
Yeah, he sent me with a note to the music store. He knew everybody. Bob Hill was the manager of the store. As a Scotsman, said, Father is crazy. He's thinking for the 15 pounds for a trumpet. But he put in his own little money to do. Everybody really respected him.
That one act of kindness, and of course he was a great anti-apartheid
And then he got me a trumpet teacher. And I'd already knew the rudiments of music as a piano player, so I learned very quickly.
Trevor Huddleston to thank for your legions of fans throughout the decades for bringing us the work and music.
Well, I mean, he was an amazing man in that when he was deported from South Africa, where he fought apartheid harder than anybody at the time. He came over and he was just obsessed with the freedom of South Africa, and he started the anti-apartheid movement when he came here. And then for 20 years, he had Trafalgar Square, where South Africa House is occupied.
Yes, yes.
All right, that's part of the interview with Hugh Masekela, the anti-apartheid activist, of course, international jazz icon, South Africa, who died last week. And this was part of a BBC interview with him about his life. 313, let's take a listen again.
Swaying slightly in my seat, I was. And you have been performing, of course, for 5 decades. You played the trumpet, the flugelhorn, the cornet, and you've been composing and singing. But it was a tough path to success for you, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, very few people are successful at success, especially in my business. I think to survive yourself is one of the greatest successes of success in my profession.
Your music is a kind of fusion of jazz with your traditional South African influences. And why I say it was tough for you, because, of course, as apartheid began to advance, we found that, there were no music schools or music lessons really for black South Africans. And then a little bit later in the early 50s, there was the Bantu Education Act, which actually limited black South Africans to maybe just 3 hours schooling a day. That was really very difficult. And you said you knew your place and never looked forward to getting anywhere in the world. It's tragic.
Yeah, well, I mean, in South Africa, and I think it was not only for an indigenous child. I think just if you're a humane person, it was against the law in South Africa. But the paradox is that the greatest activity in music in South Africa happened during the apartheid era. That's when, like, the great Miriam Makeba and the Manhattan Brothers and the musical King Kong and great musicians came out of that era, partly because the environment was very safe in that there were police coming out of the walls and the trees and everything. So it made the environment safer for the entertainment business. The police were not there to protect that, but to perpetrate apartheid as much as possible. But it created And that's when we all came up. So there was major, but there was never any music schools for Africans. There was not any lessons. We learned, myself and Jonas Gwango, my cousin, we came out of the Harrison band to play with professionals who were teenagers. And the people that we learned from were in their 30s and early 40s. And it was a hard time in that almost everybody I learned from died from booze.
Yes, you mentioned booze because, of course, you were brought up by your grandmother who ran an illegal drinking den. People all around you were drinking, including you yourself. You started drinking at 14.
13.
13.
Yeah.
There you are. And, I mean, it is documented in your own autobiography, your struggle against alcoholism. I mean, you were arguably an alcoholic by the time you were 20, 21.
And didn't know it because it was a respectable thing to be a great drinker. When it was illegal, it was one of the biggest industries among Africans. And like South Africa is probably like the biggest drinking country in the world today because of that legacy. But if you were a great drinker, you got major respect. People took their heads because it was a form of defiance. If your papers were right, you could walk up to a policeman and drunk as hell. As long as the evidence was, and say, "Would you like to see my papers?" But like I say, just about everybody I learned music from died from booze. On my mother's family side, except for my grandmother, my mother, and her aunt, everybody in my mother's family died from booze.
And yet you say that even today, drinking, you've said, is such a culture in South Africa that people don't realise what it's doing to them.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen the holiday statistics, like end of the year statistics but people, more than 17,000 people die a year in road accidents in South Africa.
And you're quite outspoken, aren't you, as a critic of heavy drinking, obviously, because of your experience.
Everybody is, because there's a major government initiative called Arrive Alive, although nobody listens to it because it's a habit. But people have to be, if they leave the house, they have to have a drink. I mean, most people... You've
battled it and you've defeated your drink demons.
I battled that and drug addiction because when I came to the States, it was a time of like a major, in the music business, major drugging. And then when I moved to Los Angeles, there was the time of flower power and the free love generation.
It's quite a common pastime. Because you moved to the United States in around 1960, the early 60s, and you were helped by friends with the international community like Yehudi Menuhin and so on, and then you married in the mid-60s, the great late Miriam Makeba.
Brought to the States by Miriam Makeba and Harry Belafonte. I'd grown up with Miriam Makeba.
You married her in the mid-60s?
Yeah, we married in 1964 to 19, and I produced a lot of records and wrote quite a few songs for her, and we worked together for over 40 years, on and off.
And you enrolled at the Manhattan School of Music. You enjoyed the tutelage of Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong, and that's when you began developing your own unique style of Afro jazz.
When I went to the States as a bebopper, I was a hell of a jazz musician, but everybody said, hey, you're just going to be a statistic if you came here for jazz, but we would like to hear some of your African stuff, I was hoping to play with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers because Wynton Marsalis came from there later, but Clifford Brown came from there, and Donald Byrd and Lee Morgan and Kenny Dorham and Freddie Hubbard, all of the great trumpet players and saxophonists came from there. But Blakey said, man, form your own group. We want to hear some of that African stuff. And
you're listening to Redline here on 910 AM. I'm Ben Calais Thompson, 313-778-7600. We'll come to you in a minute, but we're playing excerpts of an interview that Hugh Masekela gave to the BBC in 2015 for the BBC's program called Hard Talk, and Masekela reviewing his life and some of the things, his perspective on issues, and how he grew up and how he was able to make such an international impact. Here is more from that excerpted interview from Hard Talk BBC. Take a listen.
The same, and of course, Belafonte and Mary Venus. That's the only way you're going to get any notice. Otherwise, you're just going to be an outstanding bebop.
So do you think it was as a result of your exile, as it were, from South Africa that you became the renowned musician that you are?
No, I think that I never looked for fame. You know, I wanted to be a sideman. I wanted to learn. I went to classical music school, you know, to learn so that I could come back to South Africa and teach. But having been in the company of major activists, like Belafonte was the biggest fundraiser for the civil rights movement, and we're involved in all the fundraising. And I learned from him more than anybody else that if you come from a people who are underfoot and you get your juice from them, you know, then if you don't talk about them, there's something wrong with you.
You said on Channel 4 News here in the UK 5 years ago, my music was never meant to be political or even campaigning. I just sought to connect. And yet we all know Hugh Masekela as an activist, an anti-apartheid voice, as much as you are a musician.
Well, I came from an activist community. You know, have to realize that as children, we grew up in marches and boycotts and rallies. And I mean, we saw people like Nelson Mandela and them when they were in their 20s, you know, at rallies. And we grew up with it. There were more than 30 million people underfoot and everybody. I think that the biggest liberators for South Africa were all those people that are unknown that made South Africa ungovernable, and the ones who lost their lives, you know, and they're never mentioned. But we grew up in an atmosphere of like protest.
Sure. But you again, in an interview in 2012, when you were asked what was the best experience of your career, you said returning home after 30 years of exile and having a second chance to start life in the arm of my folks has been great for me. But why were you away from South Africa for 30 years?
Well, I couldn't go back to South Africa after 1964, and you know, our passports were taken away. In fact, sympathetic countries. I traveled on a Guinean passport and a Liberian passport.
So it wasn't in any way self-imposed exile. You were not allowed back until 1990?
My mother died in 1978, and my sister and I couldn't go and bury her.
So the earliest you could
mother
go back...
died 3 months after she left South Africa, and she couldn't go back to go.
So the earliest you could go back was 1990, because you're not going to hear about your self-imposed exile. You're saying that you could not have gone back before 1990.
No.
Okay.
I could have, but then I would have gone, you know. I mean, the government was so crazy by then that I could have gone right away to jail and who knows what else.
And you thought that wasn't a risk worth taking?
Well,
there were many others who went to jail and did go back.
I'll tell you, in 1963, when I finished my studies, I said goodbye to Miriam and Harry, and I said, I'm going back home. And I actually came here to England on my way back home. And Harry called me because Miriam was very sick in hospital, and she said, you know, before you go, just, you know, come and live. Anyway, to make a long story short, Harry sat me down and he said, look here, Hugh, if you go back to South Africa now, nobody knows you in the upper echelons of the government, but all they know is that you've been hanging out with us and the things you've said, and you're going to disappear. But if you stay here and make a name for yourself, you can be able to talk about your country and garner support for it.
Okay, so he did that advice. You went back in 1990 when the African National Congress, the ANC, was no longer banned. And then we saw, of course...
all the political parties were unbanned.
Black majority rule came in 1994. And of course, we know Nelson Mandela with his, you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and extending his hand to South African whites. But you yourself said, I don't think I have the power to forgive white people. That's what you told the Observer newspaper here in 2012.
Right.
You still stand